on how to get out. Before the event, it'll be in June, so mid-June, June 17th. It's a Friday, so I hope it'll be easy for you guys to kind of take that day and spend it with us. It's pretty much a full day, right? We're going to start at like 9:30 or so and end at 3. We have a good lineup of folks that will be presenting that day. We've got Cindio, who kind of really focuses on pay equity. They'll do a piece on pay transparency for us. That's pretty much, I'm sure, a very hot topic for everyone, because overall the theme for that day will be like the new realities of compensation, right? So those things that have shifted for us in the past 2 years during the pandemic, things that we now need to focus on, and of course bringing back some older things that just won't go away for compensation, things like how do we bring people in, how do we retain folks. So along with Cindio, we have UFlex Rewards that will go over personalization of rewards. We'll break for lunch, and that will be the perfect opportunity for you guys to network in person, because I know it's been a while since we've had that, especially for CCA. And then we will actually, our highlight of the day is our panel. So it'll be moderated with PayScale's Russ Wakeland. I know we had Russ join a CCA event back in February. He went over some of pay compression, pay realities with us back then as well. But we are going to have a panel that is kind of diverse. So it'll be a consultant, a comp consultant, it will be someone from HR, like the HR business partner world. We're going to have some compensation leaders. And so it'll be a big mix of folks that are talking about, the challenges that we're facing today. One of the main topics that they will be IT talent, how to attract and retain. So we hope that discussion kind of helps you guys bring back some notes to your company. And then we're actually going to close the day with an open forum. So that will be anybody gets to ask anything you guys have questions on. There will be a room full of comp experts, different industries, different divisions. And so you'll be able to kind of get your questions out there and get you probably resources as well, because we'll have our sponsors there that day. Okay, so I hope you guys will register. What I'm showing right now is on the CCA website. So if you are not on our mailing list and you happen to join us as a guest today, it's on CCA website, and it's under education CCA programs. All right. So I hope that I get to see you guys in 3D in a month or so. Aside from that, let me actually get you guys started with today's event. So that's Exec Comp 101. I see a lot more folks have joined, so let me just reintroduce. We have Mike Myers and Adam Hearn from Meridian today, who will be leading the presentation. Let me go ahead and give it off to Mike and Adam now. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ajia. So I just wanted to start out here as Adam's bringing up our presentation. Understand that today we have just under an hour, part of which will be a presentation, part of which will be some Q&A towards the end. But this is really just scraping the surface of the executive compensation world that we live so deeply in. Understand that many folks on the phone, may have a more broad-based exposure, but this concept of executive compensation is really becoming more prominent to several of you. So we will be distributing this presentation after the event, which has our contact information. Feel free to follow up with either one of us if you have questions or want to learn more about the exciting world of executive compensation. So before we get into our agenda for the day and kind of an introduction of our firm, we thought it would be helpful if Adam and I just each gave a brief introduction of ourselves. So as Wujia said, I'm Mike Meyer. I'm a lead consultant at Meridian Compensation Partners. I've spent my entire career in executive compensation, consulting on a broad matter of topics, including executive pay levels, incentive plan design, director pay, and related corporate governance type matters. Both Adam and I service approximately 12 to 15 to 18 clients. These clients, for some of our consultants, may be narrowly focused on a certain industry, but for both of us, we have clients across various, I have public, private clients, large and small, in various industries, including technology, so software, hardware, distributors, some professional services, industrials, utilities, healthcare. So that industry expertise does kind of give us a broad perspective. in terms of different things that are going on in the marketplace. And then also we bring a perspective not only with the compensation committee and the board level aspect, but also that kind of collaborative nature of how we, the consultant, work with the management team, the HR team, and the comp professionals. So that's kind of my background and a brief background of what we do. I'll hand it off to Adam to do the same.
Thanks, Mike. My name is Adam Hearn. I'm a senior consultant with Meridian Compensation Partners. I have definitely not spent my entire career in the executive compensation space. So we try to do these presentations with a little bit of a varied background to give different perspectives. I actually started after business school. I was in commercial real estate finance for about 7 years, working on the financial end of acquisitions all over the country, actually. When the real estate market collapsed, I went to law school. After law school, practiced for a bit with a large firm in their Chicago office in the executive compensation and employee benefits space. So after doing that for several years, then got into the consulting side of things, where I've been for the better part of the last 6-7 years or so. The last 3 or 4 have been with Meridian. So like Mike said, a variety of different industries show up in my book of business, as does same thing with Mike. So a variety of different clients, mostly public, mid to large cap companies, variety of different industries, usually board level representation, though we do some work for management. A couple of my clients working with management is the focus for some of the clients. But the vast majority are these larger public companies. So we hope to give you a variety of perspectives as we go through the hour. Let me take a minute and go over the agenda just so nobody's surprised here as we go. We'll start with just a couple minutes about Meridian and where the firm started, and like Mike started to allude to, the services that we offer. And then we'll really dive into sort of a high level 101 view of executive compensation and designing and implementing executive compensation plans, starting with the philosophy and developing a benchmarking peer group of companies, then really looking at incentive design, at what that means, both on a short-term or annual basis, as well as a longer-term basis. We'll talk about some of the sort of bread and butter projects that Mike and I both work on in a typical calendar year, a typical compensation cycle. We'll try to focus on what effective process really looks like, how the compensation consultant, Meridian, interacts with not just the board who typically engages us, but also with management and really tries to work collaboratively. We'll talk about a few sort of best practice governance trends and some recent developments in the area of executive compensation. We'll hopefully wrap up with a couple key takeaways and some question and answer time for everybody who's listening. So with that, please do feel free to raise hands or ask questions as we go. I know it's often easier to just wait until Q&A at the end, which we'll definitely leave time for, but we'll try to answer questions as we go if anybody has them. So we've talked about ourselves, but wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of who Meridian is as well. Prior to 2010, as many of you likely know, there were these full service consulting firms. They did human resource consulting, they did management consulting, they did much more than just executive compensation or outside director consulting. And Meridian was formed after Dodd-Frank was passed in 2010, specifically to address the idea that there were these perceived conflicts of interest. And so we are one of the largest fully independent executive compensation consulting firms in North America. We were formed specifically to get around that perceived conflict of interest. So all we do is consult on matters related to executive compensation and outside director compensation. We're about 85 to 90 consultants in 11 offices around North America, representing over 700 clients at this point. Again, mostly mid to large cap public companies, but certainly there's some private, and at least over the last couple of years, increasingly private companies that were looking to an IPO or SPAC transaction and potentially going public. But that's who we are. And maybe Mike, you want to chat for a minute about what we offer?
Yeah. So as Adam said, this firm Meridian started in 2010 and has really grown pretty tremendously since we spun off of Hewitt and Associates with about 200 to 300 clients we're now over 700 client relationships, most of which are at the board level. So if you look at this pinwheel on the right side of the screen, you know, some of you may be thinking, well, you just focus on executive compensation. What does that mean exactly? This pinwheel gives you an idea of just how many different aspects and processes that we get involved in. So the most basic and kind of what Adam alluded to as the bread and butter would be setting executive pay levels. So target opportunities typically get set towards the beginning of the year based on market competitive data that's presented in the prior year towards the end of the year, which is why our quote unquote busy cycle would be in the late fall, early winter, January, February type timeframe. So that's really our bread and butter, executive compensation pay levels. But also very much related to that would be the incentive plan designs, both from an annual bonus perspective and from a long-term incentive perspective, various different equity vehicles that can be granted to executives, vesting provisions, performance metrics and weightings, things of that nature. And then a lot of stuff that we're focused on now during what we would call our slower season is more of the check the box type items in terms of corporate governance, some of the legislative updates, and then some more building blocks to get us towards that benchmarking process, which would be the review of the executive compensation philosophy, peer group development, who we compete with for executive talent. So although we focus entirely on executive and director compensation, that includes many, many different aspects and projects that we'll get into.
So then continuing, our second topic, and where we'll probably spend most of the time, is really focusing on the design and implementation of executive compensation plans. So again, as this is kind of meant to be a high-level 101 background and information session, we want to spend a couple minutes just talking about what we mean by executive compensation. And so the overview, the colored cylinders along the left, when we talk about executive compensation, we're starting with a foundation of annual fixed cash. We're talking about a base salary. So there's obviously an expectation as an executive that you're going to receive a base salary, and that's sort of the starting point. And on top of that, you then have these variable incentive pay components. You've got a short-term or annual bonus opportunity, which I'll talk about in a second. You've got a long-term or longer-term equity opportunity. And again, these are most typical practices. There are certainly exceptions. But turning to the annual incentive piece just for a moment, again, we're talking about a target, not necessarily an actual, but we're talking about a target annual bonus opportunity. And this is usually expressed as a target percentage of base salary that a given executive would have an expectation of receiving for the year. And as we go on a bit, we'll talk about how the annual incentive opportunity is structured and measured and what that looks like. But again, just real broad strokes, the annual bonus opportunity would be the second component. The long-term or longer-term equity component is for the top executives that we're talking about. The long-term piece is typically the largest component of their overall compensation. And so understandably, that's where a lot of our focus is, that's where a lot of nuance and methodology can be important. It's not always intuitive how different groups or investors or stakeholders or the executives themselves look at long-term incentive opportunities, how they're valued. So there's a lot of room for discussion and education usually in that area. But again, we're talking about annual awards of equity in the company, and we'll do some more talking as we go on. So those are the large buckets. On top of those, there's smaller buckets for retirement, other benefits like perquisites. Those are things that are decreasing in prevalence, but historically things like tax planning, financial planning, even an executive physical that happens annually, technically those are still considered elements of compensation that we look at, but the first three are really where we're focused. And in particular, the two incentive design features are really where we're focused. But as additional backdrop, the things in this gray box go along with all of the different pay components that I just mentioned. So things in this gray box: design, how are we structuring all of these different elements? Benchmarking, like Mike talked about, is one of the sort of bread and butter projects that we do for most of our clients each year. How much, what is the pay level that is competitive for each executive? That's where we spend a lot of time. And then from a governance perspective, again, we'll talk about sort of best practice policies that either institutional investors or proxy advisory firms, which we'll touch on in a bit, want to see in place to ensure that executives' interests are properly aligned with shareholders, that the executives are not taking excessive risks just to earn themselves more of a payout at the expense of the best interests of the company or the shareholders. So things like stock ownership guidelines, a clawback policy, these are policies that are in place to make sure that the company is compliant with the most current regulations. We also spend a lot of time focused on those pieces as well. Mike, were you maybe going to chat for a minute about the philosophy?
Yeah, I can speak to philosophy. So Adam kind of gave you a 30,000-foot view of what executive comp is. So now that we know what that is, if you step into the shoes of a consultant, as we first enter the room with a new client, one thing we often want to understand, review, and make sure it's appropriate is what we call a philosophy, an executive compensation philosophy. So the reason this is so important is because it often acts as what we call a blueprint to the entire program, executive compensation program, that encompasses the pay levels. So, where are we targeting opportunities for the executives? It covers program design. And the way that it does this is by introducing a set of core objectives, right? And these core objectives are kind of explained here in that gear shift. These objectives could be anything from, we want to retain our executives, right? So how do we retain executives? We look at who the competition is for talent. So we need to establish a pool of companies that we think we're competing with in terms of business operations, size, complexity, to make sure that we're compensating our executives appropriately. Also within that, once we develop that pool, we want to know where should we be targeting our executive pay. Often you'll see the notion of targeting at the median. The reason we would typically target at the median is because we have some competition that's slightly larger, some that's slightly smaller. And so if we balance that correctly, we would target our executives typically within that median range of the market data, with various exceptions for tenure, performance. So again, this philosophy is not meant to be an end-all be-all, but instead it's more of objectives, guiding principles to help us make decisions as we implement executive compensation plans. So one of the things I mentioned in terms of philosophy is really establishing who that market is for talent, who's our competition. And so one key feature of executive compensation programs is what we call a peer group. In this case, we'll discuss a benchmarking peer group, but these peer groups can be used for various different functions. Maybe that's a good place to start is on the right side of this slide. These three bubbles are typical functions for a peer group. The first being for pay level comparisons, which I spoke to. Other uses of these peer groups could be looking at their incentive plan designs, the types of metrics they're using, weightings, vehicles, to really judge, is our program competitive? And then lastly, these groups can be used for performance comparisons as well, to gauge how well are we performing on a year-over-year growth basis, but also designing incentive plans that have metrics related to these peer groups. So a very common metric that we'll speak to later in a long-term incentive plan is what we call total shareholder return. So stock price growth plus dividends. And oftentimes this metric is compared to a peer group. So this could be our benchmarking peer group, which we use to set pay levels, or we could develop and design different peer groups for different purposes. So if we just focus on a benchmarking peer group used to help establish pay levels, you can look to the left side of this page where we show the various different criteria that we'll look at when we're developing these peer groups. So at the bottom, you'll see ultimately we want to land with a group of 15 to 25 or 30 companies that we're benchmarking against annually. If you go any smaller than that, you start to get year-over-year volatility because of the size of the group, companies shifting in and out, executive turnover, things like that. So you really want 15 to 25 companies in that peer group. And the peer group is developed based on criteria involving industry, right, at its broadest sense. So we'll start with a broad universe of US public companies. We'll start to narrow down based on operations and industries. You wouldn't want a bank in a utility peer group, right? So it's companies that are similar to us in terms of operations. In terms of size, the metric that we find most correlated with pay levels is revenue. And so our rule of thumb as consultants is typically we want companies in this peer group that are roughly 1/3 to 3 times our size in terms of revenue. And then as that could lead to 50 or 60 companies. So as we start to narrow more, we get into more of these softer criteria that could be focused around your particular business. I deal with a lot of technology distributors, which have very narrow margins. So maybe you're looking at profit margins. Maybe you're looking at more qualitative type metrics, like who are the proxy advisors using as their peer companies? We'll speak to that a bit later. Who have we gained and lost talent from? As a management team, if you're keeping track of who we've lost executive talent to or who we've recruited it from, that's another key input into this peer group that ultimately determines what's a competitive marketplace for executive pay.
So as we transition a bit from benchmarking peer groups to where I said sort of the next couple buckets on annual and long-term incentive design, again, kind of helpful to think big picture. This is probably new for at least some of you, even conceptually. So it's important, we thought, to understand how these different components work together, and that each part of the incentive design, the short-term and the long-term design, has a bunch of different pieces that need to be thought about, oftentimes have their own separate analysis that go into what are seemingly simple decisions, but can ultimately cause a lot of brain damage for boards who think through these different issues. And one of the places that we like to start the conversation about incentive design, again, both short and long term, is how does the company think about measuring success? So sort of like a philosophy, but with respect to incentive design, what should the metrics be that are used to measure success? What different industries are using as metrics changes, not just from industry to industry, but as time goes on, as industry consolidation happens, as new legislation comes out, as new regulations affect tax and accounting considerations, there's all sorts of different kinds of a calculus that go into selecting the proper and most appropriate metrics, to also incentivize the right behavior by the management team, consistent with the company's strategic direction. And one of the things that we say when we're talking to clients, we being Meridian, we're not business strategy experts, we're compensation experts. We spend a good amount of time upfront trying to get ourselves educated on the strategic direction of the company so that we can be an effective sounding board on whether the right metrics should be revenue or profitability or earnings or growth, or what those metrics should be, and whether we're dealing with a cyclical industry or whether we're in a growth phase or whether it's a tech company. Those have very real implications on what the metrics in the incentive program should be. Similarly, just with respect to the long-term piece, the choice of vehicle, whether we're talking about restricted stock that might have a time-based vesting and that's it, whether we're talking about a performance-based stock vehicle that has a performance hurdle that has to be reached in order for the vesting of the stock to occur, whether we're talking about stock options, those are all things that need to be thought through. Just with respect to how the vehicle vests, whether we're talking about annual vesting over 3 or 4 years, whether we're talking about cliff vesting at the end of a performance period, those have very real implications for wealth accumulation by the executives. And so when you're looking to attract or retain key talent, remaining competitive with what is common and typical in the market is essential as executives are weighing their career opportunities, obviously. So that takes us through sort of the middle of this page. And this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. Again, we're just trying to sort of highlight some of the key themes and ideas that have to be addressed. This far right column for performance curve, What this really means is, or what it's getting at, is goal setting. How effective is the company at identifying what the metrics are, what the goals should be in order to achieve a target annual bonus payout or a target level of equity that's granted to these executives. And above and beyond just setting the target goal, it's common for there to be a threshold goal and also a maximum or stretch goal. And so it would be common to see if a target payout is 100% of the opportunity, that a threshold payout might be 50% of the opportunity. A maximum payout might be 150 or 200% of the opportunity. But understanding what level of performance is necessary to achieve a threshold level payout or a maximum level payout, the company is going to understand those numbers, and their ability to set those goals is almost always going to exceed ours. But having those kinds of conversations is extremely common for us. So those are good vocabulary pieces and good conceptual framework for all of you to hopefully keep in mind as these conversations are ongoing. Again, more ideas here around alternative ways to think about incentive design. Again, as I said, what metrics should an annual bonus opportunity be tied to? We'll talk to this point again in a couple minutes, but it's very common for us to see something like, out of a total annual bonus opportunity, maybe 75% of that opportunity might be tied to financial metrics. So earnings or profitability, growth, some kind of return metric perhaps. But the other 25% increasingly is tied to what we call non-financial goals. And so this is where you're seeing things like individual or strategic goals, or certainly in the last couple of years, ESG related goals would often fall into this sort of 25%, 20 to 30% bucket of the total annual bonus opportunity. So that's sort of the lower, or the upper left quadrant here. The upper right, again, just concepts to keep in mind for long-term design. What metrics should that opportunity be tied to? As Mike was talking about a total shareholder return, many companies use an absolute stock price return as opposed to a relative total shareholder return. If it is a relative TSR, what group of companies is performance relative to? Is it the same as the benchmarking peer group? It might be. Otherwise, it might be a completely separate peer group just for TSR purposes. It might be an index. So there's a lot of conversation that goes into that. And then again, at the bottom, just sort of focusing on, and maybe focusing is the wrong word, but keeping in mind these different governance principles that we want to have as sort of a best practice compensation program. That you want there to be a balance of fixed and variable pay. You want a mix of annual and long-term incentive opportunity. You don't just want fixed cash most of the time. You want a mix of cash and equity. You want different but complementary performance metrics. You might consider a program that has not just absolute or just relative shareholder return, but maybe incorporates both. And we could go on and on there, but I think that's a good snapshot of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Mike, anything there before we move on to the next topic?
No, I think we can move on to benchmarking.
Okay.
This is probably something that most of you on the call may be familiar with from a broad-based standpoint. You may be familiar with that bottom left bubble of published executive compensation or compensation surveys. So some of these surveys go pretty deep into the organization. Providers such as Equilar, Aon Radford, Willis Towers Watson. So that's definitely something that we take into account in our framework for determining what type of pay levels are competitive for these executives. These surveys, go somewhat deep in the organization, but also go all the way to the top level of the CEO and CFO. What's typically different about this executive population is we're using multiple reference points. So not only do we use those types of published surveys, but we're also using that custom peer group that we developed of the companies that we compete with for executive talent. And what's beneficial about that peer group is each one of those companies are required to publicly disclose CEO, CFO, and next three highest paid executive officer pay levels, right? And so each one of them, we can see what that particular company paid in base salary, in target bonus opportunity, in long-term incentives to their CEO and CFO in particular, and then several other top of the house jobs, including general counsel, head of HR, things like that. So ultimately, the purpose of this benchmarking is not to pick a single data source or a single data point and say, this is what you should be paying your executive. It's really to use multiple data sources, use our judgment, use internal metrics such as tenure, performance, to kind of triangulate where these target opportunities should be established. So Adam, we can jump to the next slide where we start to talk about, we've talked about this in a lot of detail already, but we're not really focused so much on, how bonuses are being earned. We're not focused on the long-term incentive vesting or, realized value based on stock price growth. What we're really trying to benchmark here is target pay opportunities. This is for a group of individuals that are under committee purview, which could be, the top 5 named executive officers, additional Section 16 officers, and additional CEO direct reports is typically where the line starts to be cut off. And we're focused on the base salary, the target bonus, and the long-term incentives. These analyses typically do not cover the additional aspects of pay that Adam talked about, including perquisites, benefits, retirement benefits, things of that nature, just focused on those 3 target components. And lastly, for the benchmarking discussion, we thought it would be helpful to show you a brief client example. So again, we removed names and companies and titles for confidentiality purposes, but let's focus on these 2 charts at the bottom. This would be typical of an executive summary in our benchmarking analyses. These charts show individual by individual how their pay stacks up against the market data that we provided. And so let's focus on the chart on the left. In the middle, the blue line is the market median based on the data that we provided. Each individual box, the green and the blue boxes, is the executive's pay in relation to that median. The left chart being target total cash, which is just salary and bonus opportunity, the right being target total compensation. So what's an important reminder for all of us and to our committees that we advise is that the gray shaded area is really what we consider to be competitive, right? There's no one right answer. What we're here to do is to provide you a market perspective that gives a competitive range of the market where you can ultimately make the decision of where to pay your executives. So on the left side, plus or minus 10% is what we typically say is competitive from a cash standpoint. And on the right side, plus or minus 15% for total compensation, because there's a little more variability in that long-term incentive piece. So obviously, we would drill into each one of these individuals, talk about them on a one-by-one basis, but this is kind of that high-level executive summary that we would show the committee to show where their executive team stacks up against the market. So we kind of did a high-level overview of our typical bread and butter type projects, the different components of pay that we look at. And I think this is a good pause point here for us we did receive one question prior to the presentation, and it was regarding, how do we take our broad-based compensation skills? What's transferable to this executive compensation world? And I think this is really it in terms of process, right? So we can design the best components, the most innovative metrics and vehicles, but where we tend to see these conversations crumble is when there's not an effective process in place. And so we'll break the process down into 3 pieces, one of which being the relationship as a whole, the next being kind of the annual cycle process, and the third being meeting by meeting, what needs to happen in order to be effective and successful. So from a relationship standpoint, as Adam mentioned, we are almost always, over 90% of the time, we're engaged by the board of directors, more specifically the compensation committee of the board. So they're our boss, right? They hire us and they fire us, but it's their expectation and ours as well to work in collaboration with the management team. As Adam said, we're not experts on the company strategy. We need to know the strategy. We need to know some of the goals and objectives in place. And then ultimately, we need to develop materials and proposals that are not going to be a surprise to anyone at the table, right? So that involves a lot of pre-work with the management team, with the head of HR, executive comp individuals, VP of total rewards, those types of individuals, so that we're prepared when we have our 60 or 90 minutes with the compensation committee, that we're going in there, solid proposals, a good market perspective, that all of us are not surprised by.
And so then, like Mike talked about, from a little bit more detailed perspective, in terms of actual meeting cycles, one of the things that when we're onboarding with a new client, we're frequently struck by is that if a compensation committee's normal cadence is to have 4 or 5 meetings a year, if there's somebody on the management team who's maybe new to the role, there's this expectation that you can sort of start a little bit before the meeting and everything will fall into place with no surprises for the meeting. And that couldn't be further from the truth. From an effective process standpoint, we start at sort of the top of this wheel and work our way around. If there's 4 or 5 meetings per year, each meeting should ideally begin with setting an agenda of topics for that meeting. And as you go around clockwise, once you have the agenda, there's a whole process of developing materials where, whether it's Meridian or a different consultant, is, like Mike said, working with management to get the most current information, working then with the board, or more specifically the committee, to make sure that everything that is supposed to be addressed is sufficiently addressed, going over the materials sometimes weeks or even a month or more in advance of the meeting. We routinely have several rounds of iterations between management and ourselves, going back and forth with materials. So especially when we're working on projects that sort of start the process, like developing the philosophy, refining the peer group, in order to do the benchmarking analysis that we do every year, a lot of thinking and iterating goes into those projects. So starting with setting an agenda, developing materials, making sure that management agrees with what's in the materials and that we're aligned before we, being Meridian, goes to the committee and shows them the materials before the actual board meetings that we get to. This process frequently takes 2, 3, 4 weeks. So thinking in terms of a normal calendar of 4 or 5 meetings a year, if each one has a month's worth of work leading up to the meeting, and then as you finish up this circle, circulating minutes, debriefing, having conversations where you understand the expectations for the next meeting, any follow-up work or revisions that need to take place, it's a year-round process. And that's really sort of the key takeaway, is that for an effective process, it's not just 5 90-minute meetings a year, it's a series of back and forth conversations between all 3 groups.
Yeah, Adam, I think we can go on to item 4 here. And I think we've touched on a lot of the kind of conceptual type topics. The purpose of this agenda item is to really get you some of the trends in the industry, some of the market data. So maybe we hit some of these at a pretty high level. The data's in here to go back and reference. But again, you could follow up with questions towards the end, but we'll probably touch on this agenda topic pretty quickly.
We've said proxy advisory firms a couple of times, to Mike's point, sensitive to the fact that we only have 15 or 20 minutes left. For those of you that don't know, real quick summary, proxy advisory firms basically make recommendations to shareholders as to how they should vote on proxy proposals. ISS, or Institutional Shareholder Services, and Glass Lewis are considered the 2 most influential, with ISS being more influential than Glass Lewis probably. So good entities to know that they exist and be sensitive to, but we can certainly follow up if there are specific questions on that. But we can talk in more specifics about annual and long-term incentive design, Mike, if you want to go over those at a high level.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of annual incentives, what you'll see on the next few slides here is data from Meridian surveys. So these are, again, general industry type of surveys. They'll include the one caveat that I'll put in here. These are typically large public companies. We're talking about S&P 500 type companies. So the reason we study these is because they're kind of on the cutting edge of executive compensation, but realize that not all of these trends and prevalence metrics are necessarily applicable to all public companies. So starting here on the annual incentive piece, you'll typically see several metrics. You'll see almost 50% of companies use 2 to 3 metrics in their annual bonus plan. Almost always, one of those metrics will be surrounding profitability. So often operating income, EBIT, EBITDA, and then also other top line type metrics, sales, things that can be impacted and projected on a year-to-year basis is what you'll often see in the annual bonus plan.
And I know we talked about how ESG is increasingly becoming a component of the annual incentive opportunity. A lot of statistics, and this information changes constantly. But I don't know if, Mike, you want to make any comments about this before we move on?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway from the ESG trend, so this is ever evolving, and it started a few years ago as more of a disclosure issue, and it slowly worked its way into, institutional advisors' policies like to now see these built into executive compensation plans. Again, this is data for very high level companies, very small prevalence statistics for mid to small cap companies, but we are starting to see these environmental, clean energy, carbon reduction, as well as some of the social and governance metrics like diversity and inclusion, workplace culture, safety, right? That continues to be a key priority, work their way into the incentive plans. More often than not, it'll end up in the annual incentive plan and not into the long-term performance plan. As companies struggle as it is to set goals around these metrics, setting a 3-year goal or a longer term goal is definitely a challenge at this point. And the next slide too, I can speak to briefly in terms of how these metrics are being implemented. As Adam said, the financial metrics are often 75–80% of an annual bonus plan. We're not seeing that from these ESG types of metrics. These are, if they're given a percentage weighting, it's very small, 5 to 10 to 15%. More often than not, they're built into an existing individual performance scorecard. So if you have a 20% portion of your bonus plan devoted to individual performance, these ESG metrics will start to work their way into that component in more of a scorecard subjective type manner and not hard quantitative types of goals. The other one I'll briefly mention here would be a modifier. You're seeing that start to pop up in terms of let's leave the bonus plan alone in terms of financial performance, individual performance, but then on the back end, maybe we'll adjust that payout 5 to 10% based on these important ESG type initiatives.
Similar data here. Oh, sorry, Mike. I was just going to say similar data here from a long-term incentive design piece. The vast majority of companies are not just using one long-term incentive vehicle in their design. They're using most commonly 2, but sometimes even 3 vehicles, whether that's restricted stock that's time-based vesting, performance vesting, or stock options. Again, we can drill into this a bit more, but we want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So maybe we'll breeze through this.
Yeah, definitely. Same type of concept on the next slide with the long-term performance metrics. We've touched on this already, but total shareholder return, you'll see at the top of the chart there, is really, really common, especially during these uncertain times during COVID. Total shareholder return, if measured on a relative basis, does not require long-term goal setting. You would establish the goals at a percentile of a performance peer group. That could be a custom group, it could be an index, typically 25th, median, 75th. You set that, you establish it, and you let it go, and you see what happens. You don't have to establish internal 3-year financial projections, making it a prevalent and an easy metric to incorporate into the long-term plan that's also aligned with the shareholders.
Last thing we just want to touch on, and there's a lot of words here that we don't need to go into detail on. You'll get this slide afterwards. But the big takeaway is that the SEC historically moves very slowly. Like we touched on in the very beginning, Meridian was started largely because of the Dodd-Frank legislation that was passed in 2010. There are pieces of the rules in that legislation that still haven't been finalized. But some changes in leadership at the SEC over the last year or two, they've indicated that they're anxious to actually finalize some of these rules. So they've recently had comment periods that were open on things like clawback policies. Up until now, it's been sort of best guess as to exactly what is required under the rules. the SEC has sort of increased their activity level. So they're indicating that some of these rules might actually be finalized in the near future. So there could be some very significant changes in the regulatory space. That's just something to be aware of as you contemplate working with consultants going forward. So a lot of information. Let's just take a minute before we get to questions and talk about key takeaways. Again, at a very high level, which is where I've spent most of the time this hour talking, the compensation committee's arguably primary responsibility is to review and approve executive compensation programs. Management proposes the design based on strategy. They work cooperatively with the consultant, so with Meridian, who provides market data, an independent point of view, and really focuses on an effective process so that management is working collaboratively, like Mike said, with the committee, and we're working to provide the most helpful information and guidance that we can. So effective process is ultimately key to making sure that the goals are realized and that the company works to utilize compensation as effectively as possible.
Yeah, and just drilling down briefly into some of the components that we discussed, the first being an executive compensation philosophy, which really acts as that overall blueprint to the executive compensation program. From that philosophy, you develop a peer group or a market for competitive talent. And then once you have that market perspective, then you go into the designing of your programs, the metrics, the weightings, and then ultimately the target pay levels that the executives are receiving from a base salary, target bonus, and long-term incentive perspective. And lastly, some of these items we touched on at the end, just other items to be aware of would be market trends, which is a lot of our work at Meridian would be, compiling data on different trends in the industry, looking at the third-party perspectives from institutional advisors and as well as the proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis, and then that last legislative piece that ultimately could impact pretty significantly our jobs and executive compensation as a whole. So just helpful to keep in mind those other reference points as well.
So that was really all we had. We have about 10 minutes left for questions if there are questions.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Mike and Adam. You guys went through, I mean, that's a very large field that you tried to boil down to 45 minutes. You guys did a great job. Having been in that field for 3 years, you guys touched on all the most important topics possible. So thank you. There is one question that came through the chat and it's from Rihanna, and it's about how does exec comp in general work for non-public companies, and maybe does Meridian work with non-public companies?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I actually have like 2 to 3 private companies in my portfolio. What you'll see is that it's really an evolutionary process. For a small private company, a company less than 100 million in revenue, I would say, these types of plan designs are a bit sophisticated. Particularly, the one major difference would be on the long-term incentive piece. If you're a small private company, you're focused mainly on cash compensation, salary, and also a bonus plan. I think that bonus feature is very important for private companies because even at public companies, the bonus feature can be the most motivating because it's the most easily impacted. It's short-term goals that you know how to impact. So you'll often see a base salary and a bonus. I do have a large private client that's over 3 billion in revenue that does implement a long-term type of vehicle. Again, this is cash settled. There's no equity at stake here, but it does track the valuation of the company. So it operates similar to like a stock option, where each year this company is being valued and the higher level senior management is sharing in that value growth by being issued an option type vehicle. So you do see a similar structure at private companies. It's just with smaller private companies, a bit less sophisticated and a bit less resources, on hand. There's only so much profit to go around, and so the bonus feature is really key for those types of companies.
I would add, I also have a few private companies that I work with, and in addition to them being largely cash focused, one of the big differences in the way the bonus is designed is that if it's a smaller private company, there's oftentimes a largely discretionary piece to the bonus. And so it's less of a formulaic, less of a specifically tied to a target percentage of base salary. There's a loose understanding of what the opportunity might look like, and it's a few people who might make that decision, or maybe even just the CEO at the end of the year who makes the decision. And so I'm frequently having conversations with those clients about what a larger, more mature public company bonus structure might look like, and moving a little bit away from discretionary, sometimes lack of transparency or consistency around the annual bonus, towards a more formulaic, predictable, consistently applied bonus structure.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys also sharing some examples. I hope that answered your question, Rihanna. Anyone else? Oh, there is another one. Just as I was saying, let's see. Mike had mentioned that there are hired and fired by the Comp and Ben Committee. What is the difference in relationship for Meridian consultants with the CBC and internal exec com departments?
So I can start to speak to that. I think that's what Mike was touching on when he was really talking about how collaborative the process is, and how we are usually engaged by the committee, with the understanding that to be effective, we have to work with management closely. So I won't speak for Mike, but I know in my typical day, to the extent that there's a typical day, I'm more often talking with members of the management team. So whether that's HR, whether it's finance, whether it's the general counsel, I'm more often than not having those kinds of conversations. Day to day, that's who I'm working with, all in anticipation of presenting the findings to the committee. But day to day, I spend much more of my time talking to members of management teams.
Yeah, completely agree with that, Adam. One thing that I don't think we ever got across in terms of what if you had to sum up our purpose in one sentence, it would be to help the committee make informed business decisions, right? So we're not there, while yes, we're working with management, we can't take management's side, and we can't take the committee's side. What we're there to do is provide a third-party perspective. Oftentimes that requires working with both sides of the table to make sure there's no surprises, to make sure that those two sides are on the same page. But we're there to provide a market perspective so that together, between the management proposals and the committee's ultimate approval of those proposals, they're making informed business decisions.
Thank you. And to kind of piggyback off of John's question, personally, I had one, because when I was in this space, I know that, like, I used to work with Meridian, and yeah, you're right, it was a lot of communication with management, but seeing as I was in the comp space, I know the legal department and us would step on each other's toes over and over again. I just wanted to ask if there were like a certain set of items that you went to like the general counsel with versus going to the compensation team with, like HR.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our relationship, we work with both. And the compensation team more to develop the program structures, designs, pay levels. The legal team more so in terms of items like the proxy drafting, the compensation committee charter that gets published publicly. That's something that we work with legal with quite a bit. So more of the document related work that requires publication, right? That's where we'll work often with legal. When we're focused on designing compensation plans, it's most often with the HR and comp team.
So I would add, there are certain projects, like Mike said, like proxy drafting, for example. There are others like reviewing severance policies or procedures, change in control provisions within employment agreements or within an omnibus incentive plan or separate change in control agreements, where it does sometimes require a bit more of a legal eye. Even though some of us are attorneys, we're not practicing law, we're giving exec comp consulting advice, but we're working collaboratively with attorneys on those projects frequently. So we'll often suggest a call if we're doing complicated change in control calculations, for example, that'll ultimately work their way into a proxy. We'll work with counsel on behalf of the client to make sure that everybody's on the same page with the numbers, but with the legal issues that underlie them, things like that. So very project specific.
Thank you. appreciate the distinction. If we have one more minute, but we have one more question that came through. So if people want more information, including how to potentially join Meridian, how can they reach out?
Yes, so I think, the document will be provided to them afterwards. Is that correct?
Yes.
So both of our cards are on the front cover in terms of our information, emails, phone numbers. We're a great person. We're great people to contact in terms of working with your existing companies, working, for engagements in terms of compensation consultant. For careers at Meridian, I would say look at our website. We do have a careers page on the Meridian Compensation Partners website that will link you to our HR department, and more information about the company on our website.
Thank you. That takes us to the top of the hour. But if anyone else had any questions, I'm sure I can try to see if Mike and Adam would be able to spare them another minute or so.
While you're looking, just wanted to thank you and CCA for having us and putting on the presentation. And please don't hesitate to reach out, like Mike said, to either one of us. We're always happy to talk about the industry, our firm, the work we do, and how we can be helpful.
Likewise, this was great. I know that this is one of the bigger turnouts that we've had, so I know that this is a topic that everyone likes to do.
I saw that one come. I can.
Oh, you got one. Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
I can touch on this one because we pride ourselves on this. Go to our website. We have everything from white paper opinion type documents. We have surveys with market data perspectives. We have a podcast that you can listen to on Apple Podcasts on various different. Those are more specific topics. As opposed to broad-based. But yeah, please go to our website, look for our podcast. It's called the Executive Compensation Podcast. But we do have lots and lots of resources and training materials out there for you to access.
All right, then I will say thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you again, Adam and Mike. I do hope that I can see some of you guys on June 17th when we have our annual summit. All right, till then, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Hey, guys.